I'm calling the sheriff. Let's see whose side he takes.
Good. I approved his department's budget last week.
Some people's self-complacency is like an overinflated balloon, just a tiny needle in the right place, and it will burst with an incredibly pathetic noise. Victoria Sterling, the powerful president of the Upscale Homeowners Association, adjacent to my family farm, was standing on my private driveway, brandishing her gold-plated clipboard and screaming for the county patrol officers to seize my vintage vehicle. She claimed that my 1961 Land Rover Series IIA, a treasure I restored myself using destroyer-grade marine anti-salt paint, was nothing but mechanical trash causing an urban eyesore. She eagerly slapped a bright red citation ticket onto the windshield, completely unaware of one tiny detail: the county patrol officers she was frantically calling for help belonged to the very department whose entire annual operating budget I had just signed off on last week. There is a particular kind of silence that settles over Mist Bay Valley in the early hours of the morning, a thick rolling fog that crawls off the water and blankets the coastal pine trees. For 3 generations, my family has watched that fog roll in and out from the porch of our homestead. My grandfather cleared this land with his own hands, hauling granite stones from the riverbed to build the foundations of the barn. It is a place of deep roots of old wood and of quiet, unyielding history. When I retired from my career as the regional director of the Federal Maritime Commission, where I spent decades managing the complex infrastructure safety grants and security budgets of the entire eastern seaboard, this farm was the only place I wanted to be. I wanted nothing more than the smell of damp earth, the taste of black coffee at dawn, and the slow, methodical work of my hands. My daily routine was simple, far removed from the high-stakes negotiations in Washington or the frantic shipping port logistics that used to consume my life. I woke with the sun, brewed a strong pot of dark roast coffee, and walked out to the workshop. My primary project was a labor of absolute love, a vintage 1961 Land Rover Series IIA. It had spent nearly 34 years rusting in an abandoned boathouse down by the old municipal wharf, its steel chassis choked with salt crust, its aluminum body panels oxidized to a dull chalky white, and its engine completely seized by decades of neglect. I completely dismantled it down to the very last brass washer. Every nut and bolt was clean polished or replaced with marine-grade stainless steel equivalents. For the frame and body, I used a very specific military-grade marine anti-salt epoxy paint, the exact dark battleship gray used on the naval destroyers I used to oversee during my service. It was a paint designed to withstand the brutal corrosive onslaught of the open ocean, thick, matte, and practically indestructible. To me, that vehicle was not just a machine, it was a rolling monument to resilience, a testament to the idea that with enough patience, precision, and respect for history, anything can be saved from decay. But to Victoria Sterling, it was an intolerable blemish on her manufactured paradise. Victoria had moved to the valley 5 years ago, heading up a massive high-end residential development called Mist Bay Heights. The development was a collection of identical sprawling mansions with manicured lawns that looked like plastic turf, all managed under a ruthlessly strict homeowners association. Victoria, elected as the board president, ruled her little suburban empire with an iron clipboard. She was a woman who lived for regulations, a person who believed that the world could be bent to her will if she only wrote enough fines. She wore her authority like cheap perfume, heavy and suffocating. Her signature weapon was a gold-plated clipboard, which she clutched to her chest like a shield, and she was rarely seen without her oversized designer sunglasses, even on the foggiest of coastal mornings. She paced the perimeter of the Heights daily, searching for the slightest deviation from the HOA's 1,000-page rulebook. A trash can left out 10 minutes past the collection time, a flower bed with the wrong shade of mulch, or a mailbox painted a non-approved shade of beige. Nothing escaped her wrath. For months, Victoria had been casting greedy, speculative glances across the property line. My homestead, with its weathered red oak barn, its wild wildflower pastures, and its long gravel driveway, stood in stark, beautiful contrast to the sterile beige monotony of Mist Bay Heights. To Victoria, my farm was an unfinished puzzle piece that she desperately needed to acquire to complete her development's master plan. She envisioned a pristine, multi-lane paved entrance boulevard, a golf course expansion, and perhaps a row of additional luxury villas where my family's historical pastures sat. She had sent polite letters at first offering to buy the land for a fraction of its true market value, couched in corporate real estate jargon about neighborhood synergy and modern revitalization. When I ignored her offers, the letters became progressively colder, filled with veiled threats about zoning laws, environmental impact studies, and municipal codes. She even went so far as to suggest that my gravel driveway was causing dust pollution that violated the HOA's clean air policies. But I knew the law better than she ever could. I knew that my family's land grant dated back to 1867, signed by the federal government under the post-Civil War Reconstruction Acts long before her development company was even a distant thought. We were completely legally and permanently outside of her jurisdiction. The Vance homestead was a sovereign pocket of land in the middle of her planned community, and that fact drove her absolutely mad. But Victoria was not a woman accustomed to hearing the word no. She mistook my quiet nature for compliance, my silence for submission. She believed that because I wore faded denim work shirts and spent my afternoons covered in grease beneath a vintage truck, I was just another stubborn, uneducated old man who could be bullied into surrender. She began her campaign of active petty harassment, sending her private HOA security inspectors to stand at the edge of my property line, taking photos of my wood piles, my tractor, and eventually my beloved Land Rover. She claimed the vehicle was an eyesore, a piece of industrial debris that lowered the property values of her pristine neighborhood. Every morning I would find a new notice stain on my fence post, demanding its immediate removal under threat of massive civil penalties. I never responded. I simply folded the papers, filed them away in my study, and went back to my work. I was waiting. I knew that people like Victoria always eventually overreach, driven by their own inflated egos, and when they do, the legal fallout is spectacular. The confrontation escalated to an entirely new level on a crisp Tuesday morning. I was sitting on my front porch holding a steaming mug of coffee, watching the coastal fog slowly lift from the bay. The quiet of the valley was shattered by the sharp, rhythmic click-clack of high heels on my gravel driveway. It was a sound as out of place in this valley as a neon sign in an ancient redwood forest. I looked up to see Victoria marching toward my workshop, her face twisted in a mask of righteous fury. Behind her were two of her hired HOA security guards, young men wearing tactical vests and carrying tactical radios that looked far too clean to have ever seen real service. They walked with their chests puffed out, trying to look intimidating, but they looked more like children playing dress-up. She didn't bother to knock or call out. She walked straight up to the open bay door of my workshop, where the Land Rover was parked, its freshly painted gray body gleaming in the soft morning light. She tapped her gold-plated clipboard with a manicured nail, the sound sharp, hollow, and incredibly grating. "Mr. Vance," she barked, her voice carrying across the quiet pasture and echoing off the side of the barn. "This ends today. This mechanical monstrosity has been parked in violation of the Miss Bay Heights aesthetic guidelines for over 90 days. It is an unregistered, non-compliant vehicle, and it is actively degrading the visual integrity of our upscale community. I have issued multiple warnings, and you have chosen to ignore every single one of them." I took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee, remaining seated in my wooden rocking chair. "Good morning, Victoria," I said, keeping my voice calm, low, and perfectly steady. "You seem to have lost your way. This is the Vance homestead. It is private property. If you look at your own development maps, you will find that your HOA jurisdiction ends precisely 40 feet east of where you are currently standing. You are on my land." Victoria scoffed, a high mocking sound that she probably practiced in her mirror. "Do not play legal games with me, old man. We have an easement through this entire corridor. This driveway is part of the scenic approach to the heights. I have already drafted the public nuisance citation, and if this junk is not moved within 24 hours, I will have it towed and impounded at your expense. Your little hobby is officially a public nuisance." She stepped forward, pulling a bright red, heavy-duty adhesive citation sheet from her clipboard. With an aggressive theatrical slap, she pressed it onto the pristine windshield of the Land Rover. The adhesive was cheap and thick, the kind that leaves a sticky, ruined residue on glass, designed to be as difficult to remove as possible. There she sat, a smirk spreading across her face as she stepped back, admiring her handiwork. "Consider yourself officially served, and don't bother trying to appeal it to the board. The board has already voted unanimously. We are cleaning up this valley whether you like it or not. Your little dinosaur of a truck is going to a scrapyard." I looked at the red paper on my windshield, then back at Victoria. I could feel the cold, quiet anger settling deep in my chest. The exact same focus I used to get when managing multi-million-dollar shipping crises in the North Atlantic or coordinating maritime security operations with the Coast Guard. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't stand up. I simply looked her in the eye. Victoria, I said quietly, my voice carrying a weight that she was too arrogant to notice. I suggest you take that paper off my vehicle. The paint on that frame is destroyer-grade marine epoxy. The glass is tempered safety glass from a naval supply yard. But the driveway you are standing on is sacred. You are trespassing on land that has belonged to my family since the 19th century. I have been very patient with your letters, but when you touch my property, you cross a line you cannot uncross. She laughed a harsh, dismissive sound that echoed through the trees. Or what you'll call the police go ahead. I have the county sheriff's department on speed dial. They know me personally. In fact, I'm calling them right now to report an illegal hazardous vehicle on the scenic right-of-way and an uncooperative property owner. Let's see whose side they take when they see this eyesore. She pulled her sleek, gold-cased phone from her designer pocket and began dialing, her fingers moving with venomous speed. She held the phone to her ear, glare staring at me through her designer glasses, waiting for me to panic or beg. I didn't move a muscle. I just watched her, knowing that she had just pulled the pin on a grenade she was still holding in her hand, completely oblivious to the countdown. While Victoria stood in my driveway, shrilly demanding immediate police assistance from the county dispatcher. I stood up from my rocking chair, walked inside my house, and closed the wooden screen door behind me. I walked down the hallway to my study. The room was lined with old oak shelves filled with leather-bound logs, maritime charts, and federal records. On the wall hung a framed commendation from the Department of Homeland Security, alongside a photograph of me standing with the governor in the state's congressional delegation. I sat at my heavy mahogany desk and pulled up the local county public safety portal on my computer. As the former regional director of maritime infrastructure, one of my final acts before retirement was the restructuring of the regional coastal security grants. Mist Bay County was a coastal municipality heavily reliant on federal funding to maintain its Marine Patrol divisions, its tactical response units, and its harbor security. Just last week, as the president of the Regional Development Committee, I had personally signed the authorization papers for the county's entire annual public safety budget. A budget of nearly $8 million, which funded everything from the deputies' salaries to the very patrol cars they drove. The sheriff, a reasonable man named Thomas Miller, knew me very well. We had spent many afternoons in coordination meetings discussing port security and emergency preparedness. I picked up my desk phone and dialed the sheriff's direct private line. "Sheriff Miller speaking," the voice on the other end answered. "Tom, it's Marcus Vance," I said, my voice steady. "Marcus, good to hear from you." Tom's tone was instantly warm and respectful. "How is the retirement treating you? Are you finally getting some rest on that beautiful farm of yours?" I was Tom, until a few minutes ago. Right now, I have Victoria Sterling standing in my driveway demanding that your deputies tow my 1961 Land Rover from my own workshop. There was a long silence on the other end of the line, followed by a heavy sigh. Victoria Sterling. She's been a thorn in everyone's side with that HOA. What is she claiming? She's claiming my driveway is an HOA scenic easement, I explained. She's currently screaming at your dispatcher, trying to force a deputy to come down here and seize my vehicle. But more importantly, Tom, she is trespassing on the historical land grant parcel. And as you know, that parcel is entirely exempt from municipal zoning under the 1867 charter. "I know the property lines well, Marcus," Sheriff Miller said, his voice turning serious. "My deputies are not a private security force for the HOA. I'll dispatch Deputy Kowalski and Deputy Chen immediately. They're already patrolling the Bay Road. I'll instruct them to handle this personally." "Thank you, Tom," I said. "But while you're at it, could you do me one more favor? Have your dispatcher contact the County Zoning and Land Records Department. Ask them to pull the municipal GIS survey map for Mist Bay Heights, specifically Section 4, Block B. I believe the HOA's brand new $2.5 million community clubhouse might have a very serious boundary issue." There was a brief pause, and then I could hear the faint sound of typing on the other end of the line. "Section 4, Block B. That's the parcel bordering your western fence line, isn't it?" "Exactly," I said. "My grandfather's original deed includes a 50-foot wide maritime right-of-way for emergency access to the old pier. The HOA paved over part of it last year to build their luxury clubhouse and pool. I didn't say anything at the time because I wanted to verify the exact survey coordinates first. I have the certified federal survey right here on my desk. The clubhouse is sitting squarely on federal maritime easement land that falls directly under the administration of the Maritime Commission, which, as you know, I still represent as an emeritus advisor." I heard Sheriff Miller chuckle, dry knowing sound. Marcus, you always were 3 steps ahead of everyone in the room. I'll have the county building inspector, Dave Vance, no relation to you, of course, head down there with the deputies. This is going to get very interesting very quickly. I'll see you down here, Tom, I said and hung up the phone. I walked back out to the porch, my coffee now lukewarm but my mind sharp. Victoria was still on her phone, pacing back and forth, gesturing wildly. When she saw me come back out, she hung up and pointed her gold-plated clipboard at me like a sword. The deputies are on their way, she sneered. They're sending a patrol unit immediately. I told them this was an ongoing public hazard. You've had your warnings, Mr. Vance. Now you're going to learn what happens when you try to ignore the rules. I look forward to it, Victoria, I said, leaning back against the wooden railing of my porch. Let's see what happens when the rules are applied. Within 15 minutes, the quiet of the valley was interrupted once again, this time by the low, powerful rumble of utility engines. A large flatbed towing truck from the county's contracted impound lot pulled up to the gate, its yellow lights flashing lazily in the morning sun. Behind it came 2 sleek black and white county sheriff patrol SUVs, their tires kicking up gravel as they pulled into my driveway. Victoria's face lit up with a look of absolute triumph. She actually clapped her hands together, her gold-plated clipboard rattling against her bracelets. Excellent, she gloated, turning to her security guards. We are going to make an example of this old man. I want photos of the vehicle being loaded onto the flatbed. We'll put them in the monthly newsletter to show the residents that no one is above the standards of Miss Bay Heights. The tow truck driver, a burly man named Carl, whom I had known for years from my time at the port, got out of his cab looking incredibly uncomfortable. He walked toward the workshop, looking at me with an apologetic shrug. Morning, Mr. Vance, Carl said, tipping his cap. I got a call from the county dispatcher about an abandoned vehicle. I didn't realize it was your place. Morning, Carl, I replied, nodding. Don't worry about it. You're just doing your job. But before you hook anything up, you might want to wait for the deputies to finish their assessment. Victoria stepped in, her voice shrill. There is nothing to assess. The vehicle is in clear violation of community guidelines on an active easement. Driver, hook it up immediately. I am the president of the HOA, and I am authorizing this tow. Carl looked at Victoria, then at me, and wisely decided to take a step back, folding his arms. I don't tow from private property without a deputy's signature, ma'am, especially not from the Vance farm. At that moment, the doors of the patrol SUVs opened. Deputy Kowalski, a veteran officer with 15 years on the force, and Deputy Chen, a sharp younger deputy, stepped out. They adjusted their duty belts and walked toward us, their expressions neutral and professional. Victoria practically ran to meet them, her heels sinking into the gravel. Deputies, thank goodness you're here. This man has been harboring this industrial waste in his yard for months. He is refusing to comply with our lawful removal orders, and he's being incredibly confrontational. I need you to sign the authorization for the tow truck immediately. Deputy Kowalski didn't look at her clipboard. He walked straight past her, his eyes locked on me. As he reached the steps of my porch, his posture changed. He stood straight, brought his hand to the brim of his hat, and delivered a crisp, formal military salute. Good morning, Commissioner Vance, Kowalski said, his voice clear and respectful. Sheriff Miller sent us down personally. He wanted us to ensure that your property security is fully intact. Deputy Chen followed suit, saluting with equal respect. Good morning, sir. It's an honor to meet you. The sheriff told us about your service with the Maritime Commission. Victoria froze. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. Her designer sunglasses slipped slightly down the bridge of her nose, revealing wide, disbelieving eyes. The gold-plated clipboard trembled in her hand. See, Commissioner, she stammered, looking between the deputies and me. What do you mean, Commissioner? This is just Marcus Vance. He's a retired mechanic who lives on this old farm. Deputy Kowalski turned to her, his expression hardening into a stern professional mask. Ma'am, you are speaking to Commissioner Marcus Vance, former regional director of the Federal Maritime Commission and the current chairman of the Regional Public Safety Budget Committee. Just last week, the commissioner personally approved the funding for our entire department's tactical and patrol operations, including the very vehicles we drove in on today. He paused, letting the words sink in. Victoria looked as if she had just swallowed a lemon. Furthermore, Kowalski continued, the sheriff's office has conducted an immediate record check on this parcel. This property is the Vance homestead, established under a federal land grant in 1867. Under state and federal law, this land is entirely exempt from municipal zoning and has absolutely no association with Miss Bay Heights. The HOA has zero legal authority here. But the easement, Victoria cried, her voice cracking. We have a scenic easement through this road. The easement you are referring to, Deputy Chen spoke up, pulling out a printed document, is a non-exclusive utility easement granted to the county in 1954 for power lines. It does not grant the HOA any property rights, nor does it allow you to dictate what the property owner does on his own driveway. Frankly, ma'am, you are currently trespassing on federal grant land after being asked to leave. Victoria's face turned from pale white to a deep, furious crimson. This is absurd. This is a good old boys club. I will call my lawyers. I will have you all investigated. Go ahead and call them, Victoria, I said, finally standing up from my chair and walking down the steps. Because while you have your lawyers on the phone, you might want to ask them about Section 4 Block B. As if on cue, another vehicle pulled into the driveway. This one was a white county SUV with the words Department of Building and Land Safety painted on the side. Dave, the county's chief building inspector, stepped out, carrying a large roll of blueprint maps and a rugged digital tablet. He walked past the stunned Victoria, nodded respectfully to me, and shook my hand. Commissioner Vance, good to see you, Dave said. We ran the GIS overlay and the historical surveys as the sheriff requested. I've got the results right here. He unrolled the map on the hood of my Land Rover, pinning it down with his tablet. He pointed to a bright red line that cut directly through the eastern boundary of my property, right where the lush lawns of Mist Bay Heights began. According to the original 1867 charter, Dave explained, his voice booming across the driveway, the Vance parcel includes a 50-foot wide federally protected maritime right-of-way that extends all the way from the county road to the historical Deepwater Pier on the bay. This easement was designed to guarantee access for emergency marine transport and defense. He shifted his finger on the map, pointing to a large rectangular structure that sat directly over the red line. Last year, Mist Bay Heights constructed their community clubhouse and Olympic-sized luxury pool. According to our GIS analysis, which we just verified with the county surveyor, the HOA built their clubhouse exactly 22 feet over their property line. More than half of that $2.5 million facility is sitting squarely inside Commissioner Vance's federally protected maritime easement. Victoria gasped, clutching her gold-plated clipboard to her chest like a shield. That's impossible. Our developers did a full survey. Your developers used a standard municipal survey that ignored the historical federal grant records, Dave replied coldly. Because this is a federal easement, the construction of any permanent structure without a federal maritime waiver is a Class A civil violation. Under federal code, the county is required to issue an immediate stop work and vacate order. Dave reached into his folder and pulled out a bright yellow document heavily stamped with the county's official seal. I walked over to Victoria and handed it to her. This is an official notice of violation and an emergency order to vacate, Dave said. The Mist Bay Heights clubhouse and pool are declared non-compliant hazardous structures. You have exactly 72 hours to secure the facility and fence it off. After that, the county will begin the process of court-ordered demolition to restore the maritime easement, with all costs billed directly to the HOA. Victoria stood frozen, her eyes darting across the yellow paper. The arrogance that had defined her for months seemed to evaporate in an instant, replaced by a cold, numbing panic. She looked at her two security guards, but they were already stepping back, completely unwilling to get involved in a federal land dispute. The tow truck driver, Carl, laughed quietly, climbed back into his truck, and drove away, his yellow lights still flashing as he disappeared down the gravel road. This will ruin us, Victoria whispered, her voice barely a squeak. The HOA reserve fund can't cover a demolition. The homeowners will sue the board. They'll sue me. You should have thought about that before you started looking for trash in other people's yards, Victoria, I said, looking down at her. You spent months trying to find a reason to find me, trying to take my family's land to satisfy your own vanity. You wanted to apply the rules. Well, these are the rules, and they are far older and far stronger than your HOA. She looked up at me, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and hatred. Without another word, she turned on her heel and began to walk back down the driveway, her high heels kicking up dust, her gold-plated clipboard dangling uselessly at her side. Her security guards followed her in silence, their heads bowed. The fallout from that morning was swift and absolute. Within 48 hours, news of the demolition order had spread through Mist Bay Heights like wildfire. The residents, wealthy and influential people, who had tolerated Victoria's tyrannical rule, only because they wanted to protect their investments, were utterly outraged. They realized that their pristine neighborhood was now facing a multi-million-dollar lawsuit, the loss of their prized clubhouse, and a massive spike in their monthly dues to cover the legal disaster Victoria had created. An emergency meeting of the HOA was called that Friday night. I didn't attend, but from my porch, I could hear the faint, angry rumble of voices from the neighborhood. By Saturday morning, Victoria Sterling had been officially stripped of her presidency, and the entire HOA board had resigned in disgrace. The residents appointed a new reasonable board president, a retired school teacher named Eleanor, who immediately reached out to me to beg for a resolution. They knew that if I pressed the issue, the federal courts would order the complete demolition of their clubhouse, leaving them with nothing but a pile of rubble and a massive debt. I met Eleanor on my porch on Sunday afternoon. She was nervous, clutching a folder of financial records, her voice soft and apologetic. "Mr. Vance," she said, her hands trembling slightly, "we are so incredibly sorry for how Victoria treated you. Her actions were unacceptable, and they do not represent the people of this community. We are begging you for mercy. If we have to demolish the clubhouse, many of our families will face financial ruin." I looked at her, then out at my Land Rover, which was now parked in front of my workshop, free of the red citation ticket. The dark gray battleship paint looked beautiful in the afternoon sun, a symbol of hard work and resilience. "Eleanor," I said, keeping my voice gentle, "I am not a vengeful man. I only wanted to be left in peace on my family's land. I have no desire to see your residence ruined because of one woman's arrogance." I pulled a document from my pocket, one that I had drafted with my lawyers over the weekend. "This is a boundary agreement," I explained, handing it to her. "I will grant the HOA a permanent, non-exclusive maritime waiver for the clubhouse. The structure can remain standing, but it comes with 3 absolute non-negotiable conditions." Eleanor looked up, hope flickering in her eyes. "Anything, Mr. Vance. What are the conditions?" "First," I said, "the HOA will pay for the full restoration of my driveway, including the installation of a historic wrought iron gate at the entrance to my property, clearly marking the boundary of the Vance homestead. Second, the HOA will completely exempt my property and any future heirs to this land from any and all aesthetic, zoning, or access complaints. You will never set foot on this land again without my written permission." "Of course," Eleanor nodded eagerly. "That is entirely fair. And the third condition?" "Third," I smiled slightly, "the HOA will lease the northern wing of the clubhouse to the county's youth maritime program for the sum of $1 per year. We will use that space to establish a free weekly program to teach local children about marine safety, boat restoration, and coastal conservation. I will personally oversee the program as a volunteer instructor." Eleanor stared at me, her eyes filling with tears of relief. You would do that after how you were treated?" "Like I said, Eleanor," I replied, taking a sip of my coffee, "you don't win a neighborhood by being right. You win it by being decent. I want this valley to be a community, not a collection of rules." She signed the papers right there on the porch, her pen moving with a quiet, grateful speed. Today, the Vance homestead is quieter than ever. The beautiful wrought iron gate stands proudly at the entrance of my driveway, a quiet, elegant reminder of where the rules of the HOA stop and the history of my family begins. The youth maritime program is thriving, and every Saturday, the sound of children's laughter echoes from the clubhouse down to the bay. And as for my 1961 Land Rover, it runs beautifully now. Every now and then I take it for a drive through the manicured streets of Mist Bay Heights, the engine purring like a kitten, the battleship gray paint catching the light. The residents always wave as I pass, their smiles warm and genuine. They know who owns the land beneath their feet, and they know that sometimes the quietest man in the room is the one you should never ever cross. To understand why this land is so sacred to me, you have to understand the letters and the logs my grandfather left behind in the old leather trunk in the attic. The Vance family did not just settle in Mist Bay. They carved it out of a wilderness of rock and saltwater. In the winter of 1867, my grandfather, a veteran of the Union Navy's blockading squadrons, arrived here on a battered wooden schooner with little more than a bag of hand tools and a parcel map signed by the General Land Office in Washington. The map was printed on thick parchment paper stamped with the official seal of the United States. It was a land grant, a reward for his years of hazardous service on the ironclads of the Mississippi River. The land was rough, rocky, and constantly battered by the Atlantic winds, But to a man who had spent 4 years surrounded by coal smoke and the roar of cannons, it was the closest thing to heaven on earth. In his daily logs, written in a tight, elegant cursive script with faded iron gall ink, he recorded the monumental struggle of those early years. He spent the first 3 months living in a crude canvas tent pitched beneath a giant white pine while he slowly cleared the dense forest of red oak and hickory to make room for his first cabin. Every single rock that forms the foundation of my current workshop was hauled by hand from the shoreline using a stone boat and a team of oxen. He didn't just build a shelter, he established a legacy. He wrote of the importance of the maritime right-of-way, a 50-foot strip of land that ran from the county road straight down to the Deepwater Cove. In those days, before paved roads existed in the valley, the cove was the only link to the outside world. It was where the supply boats landed, where the mail was delivered, and where the community gathered in times of emergency. He wrote a passage in his logbook dated October 14, 1872, that I have kept memorized my entire life. This soil is not merely dirt to be bought and sold by speculators. It is paid for with the blood of our comrades and the sweat of our brows. Let no man, no matter how wealthy or powerful, ever dictate how a Vance tends to his own harbor. Keep the gate open to those in need, but lock it tight against the arrogant. That logbook was my constant companion during my decades of service in the Federal Maritime Commission. Whenever I found myself stuck in endless bureaucratic meetings in Washington, D.C., or dealing with corrupt port officials in distant harbors, I would close my eyes and picture the quiet gray stones of the Miss Bay homestead. I knew that my time in the city was temporary, but the farm was permanent. I was merely the current custodian of a legacy that had survived world wars, economic depressions, and the slow, relentless march of suburban expansion. When Victoria Sterling first arrived with her glossy brochures and her teams of land surveyors, she saw nothing but empty acreage to be subdivided and sold. She didn't see the historical value of the old cedar fence posts, which my father had carved by hand. She didn't see the significance of the old granite well house, which had provided pure water to generations of travelers. She saw my farm as a blank space on her master plan, a nuisance that was preventing her from creating a seamless, high-end gated community. She believed that with enough money and a battery of high-priced corporate attorneys, she could easily sweep away 150 years of history. She did not realize that some things cannot be bought and that the laws protecting historical land grants are far more deeply rooted in the American legal system than any modern municipal zoning ordinance. The fall of Victoria Sterling was not just a local scandal. It became a cautionary tale that was discussed in real estate and municipal planning circles across the entire state. After she was stripped of her HOA presidency during that fateful Friday night emergency meeting, her life began to unravel with terrifying speed. The residents of Miss Bay Heights, realizing that they had been led into a multi-million-dollar legal trap, began to examine the financial records of the HOA board during Victoria's tenure. What they found was a shocking pattern of financial mismanagement, conflicts of interest, and outright embezzlement. It turned out that Victoria had not just been overzealous with her rules. She had been using the HOA's massive reserve fund as her personal piggy bank. She had awarded lucrative landscaping, paving, and construction contracts to companies owned by her immediate family members and close business associates, often paying twice the market rate for substandard work. The brand new $2.5 million community clubhouse, which had been built squarely on my maritime right-of-way, had been constructed by a development firm owned by her brother-in-law. The contract had been awarded without any competitive bidding process, and the construction records were filled with falsified inspections, cheap materials, and inflated invoices. The county building department, prompted by Dave's discoveries, launched a comprehensive investigation into the entire Miss Bay Heights development. They uncovered dozens of major building code violations, structural defects in the luxury homes, and massive environmental non-compliance issues regarding the development's storm runoff drainage systems. Victoria's brother-in-law's construction company was immediately stripped of its operating licenses, and the county prosecutor's office began drafting a series of criminal indictments for fraud, bribery, and embezzlement. Victoria's gold-plated clipboard was replaced by a stack of legal summonses. Within 6 months, she was forced to sell her sprawling mansion in Miss Bay Heights at a massive loss to pay for her mounting legal defense fees. Her husband, a prominent corporate executive who had been deeply embarrassed by the entire public spectacle, filed for divorce, leaving her to face the criminal charges alone. She eventually pleaded guilty to multiple counts of grand larceny and fraud, receiving a substantial sentence of federal probation and a court order to pay hundreds of thousands of dollars in restitution to the HOA reserve fund she had plundered. The last time I saw Victoria Sterling, she was sitting in the back of a cheap sedan, her designer sunglasses missing her face, pale, worn, and lined with stress. She was leaving the valley for good, her dreams of a suburban empire completely shattered. She didn't look at my farm as she drove past, but I stood on my porch, my hand resting on the warm hood of my 1961 Land Rover, watching her go. It was a somber reminder of the absolute truth of my grandfather's words. Arrogance is a heavy burden, and those who carry it will always eventually sink under its weight. The transformation of the northern wing of the clubhouse into the Miss Bay Youth Maritime Center was the true victory of this entire saga. It was a victory not of destruction, but of construction, not of revenge, but of restoration. The new HOA board, eager to rebuild their relationship with me, and the county went above and beyond to comply with the third condition of our boundary agreement. They completely cleared out the luxury lounge and private bar in the clubhouse's north wing, replacing the leather sofas and gold fixtures with sturdy oak workbenches, marine tool racks, and large drafting tables for navigation maps. We painted the walls a clean, bright maritime white decorated with historic photographs of the valley and vintage naval flags. The program was an instant, overwhelming success. Every Saturday morning, the quiet of the bay is filled with the excited voices of 25 to 30 young boys and girls from the surrounding county. Many of them from underprivileged families who had never had the opportunity to experience the beauty of the sea. They arrive at the center eager to learn, their eyes wide with curiosity as they look at the various boat hulls, sails, and tools we have gathered. I teach them the ancient art of wooden boat building, showing them how to select the right cedar planks, how to steam bend ribs, and how to drive copper rivets with precision. We are currently working on a joint project, the restoration of an old 12-foot wooden rowboat that we salvaged from the same boathouse where I found my Land Rover. The kids do all the work themselves under my careful supervision. They measure, sand, paint, and varnish, learning the value of patience, hard work, and attention to detail. But we don't just stay in the workshop. We take them out onto the water, teaching them how to read the wind, how to navigate by the stars, and how to respect the immense power of the ocean. We teach them about coastal conservation, showing them how to protect the delicate marine ecosystem of the bay and ensure that it remains clean and healthy for generations to come. Many of the county deputies, including Kowalski and Chen, regularly volunteer their own free time to help with the program, teaching water safety and emergency rescue techniques. The Land Rover Series IIA has become the official support vehicle of the youth program. We use it to haul the boats down to the water, to carry safety gear, and to transport the kids to various field trips along the coast. The children love the old truck, often fighting over who gets to ride in the front seat next to the Admiral, a nickname they affectionately gave me despite my actual rank of Vice Admiral. When I look at the kids working together in the workshop, their faces bright with determination, I know that my grandfather would be incredibly proud. The land grant of 1867 is no longer just a piece of historical parchment. It is a living, breathing part of the community, a source of education, inspiration, and strength for the youth of Miss Bay Valley. We did not just protect our homestead, we rebuilt our harbor, and in doing so, we ensured that the spirit of the valley will endure forever. For those who appreciate the finer details of historical mechanical restoration, the work on my 1961 Land Rover Series IIA is worth examining in exhaustive depth. When I first dragged it out of the rotting boathouse, it was a shadow of its former self, a rusted carcass that most sane people would have sent straight to the crushing yard. The chassis, a steel box section design, had been subjected to 30 years of damp sea air and occasional saltwater flooding. It had suffered from severe rust out along the rear crossmember and the front outriggers. My first task was to build a heavy steel rolling spit in my workshop so I could perform a complete frame-off restoration. I sandblasted the entire frame down to bare steel, exposing every single weak point in microcrack. Using a high-output MIG welder, I fabricated and welded in new heavy-duty steel outriggers and a brand new military-spec rear crossmember. Once the structural integrity of the frame was restored, I applied 3 coats of hot-dip zinc galvanizing compound, followed by a thick layer of coal tar epoxy. This was the exact same industrial coating system used to protect the ballast tanks of ocean-going tankers from internal corrosion. I knew that after this treatment, the frame would easily survive another 100 years of coastal moisture without a single speck of rust. The engine, a 2.25-liter four-cylinder overhead valve gasoline unit, was completely seized. The pistons were rusted solid to the cylinder walls, and the aluminum cylinder head had suffered from severe galvanic corrosion around the water jacket ports. I spent 3 weeks slowly dripping a mixture of acetone and automatic transmission fluid into the cylinders, waiting for the chemical reaction to break the rust grip. When it finally freed, I bored the engine block 40 thousandths of an inch over installing new high-compression pistons, a high-performance camshaft, and hardened valve seats in the head to allow the engine to run safely on modern unleaded fuel. The transmission, a 4-speed manual unit with a 2-speed transfer case and selectable 4-wheel drive, was completely disassembled. I replaced every single bearing seal and synchromesh ring with original new old stock components that I managed to source from an old military surplus warehouse in England. The brass shift forks were polished, and the transfer case gears were shimmed with meticulous precision to eliminate the classic Land Rover gear whine. But the most challenging part of the restoration was the paint and bodywork. The Series IIA body is constructed from Burma Bright, a unique aluminum magnesium alloy that is highly resistant to corrosion, but incredibly difficult to prep and paint. The panels had been dented, scratched, and covered in layers of cheap, peeling house paint applied by previous owners. I spent hundreds of hours block sanding the panels by hand, using hammer and dolly techniques to smooth out every single ripple without stretching the soft aluminum. For the final finish, I chose a very specific coating, a multi-part aliphatic polyurethane marine paint. This paint is used primarily on the superstructure of military naval destroyers and commercial offshore oil platforms. It is incredibly thick, highly resistant to ultraviolet radiation, and completely impervious to salt spray fuel spills and physical impacts. I sprayed the panels in a deep matte battleship gray, matching the original naval color scheme of my former fleet command. The result was a finish that was not only visually striking, but practically indestructible, a rugged, functional coat of armor that perfectly suited the character of the vehicle. When Victoria Sterling called it mechanical trash, she was revealing her own profound ignorance. She saw only an old, boxy utility vehicle, completely unable to appreciate the hundreds of hours of precision engineering, historical preservation, and craftsmanship that had gone into every single square inch of its restoration. She could not comprehend that, to a person of substance, a beautifully restored piece of mechanical history is infinitely more valuable than any mass-produced plastic-trimmed luxury SUV that money can buy. The final chapter of this long dispute was written on a beautiful Saturday afternoon in late autumn during the official dedication ceremony of the Vance Homestead's new entrance gate. The new HOA board, true to their word, had hired a local master blacksmith to design and forge a stunning custom wrought iron gate. The blacksmith, a man named Samuel, who had been trained in the traditional European methods of ironwork, spent 3 months crafting the gate in his coal-fired forge. The design was magnificent, featuring intricate hand-hammered scrollwork that mirrored the waves of Mist Bay with a beautiful stylized representation of my grandfather's 1867 schooner integrated into the center arch. On either side of the gate, 2 massive granite pillars constructed from stones reclaimed from the old family pier stood like silent sentinels, marking the exact boundary of the historical land grant. Instead of a private, quiet installation, the HOA board had turned the event into a massive community picnic. They set up long wooden tables along the edge of my wildflower pasture, piling them high with fresh local seafood, roasted sweet corn, and homemade pies. More than 100 residents from Mist Bay Heights walked down the hill to attend their children running through the fields, playing games with the kids from the Youth Maritime Program. Sheriff Miller and several of his deputies were there, leaning against their patrol cars and laughing with the locals. Dave, the county building inspector, was cooking burgers on a large iron grill, a giant smile on his face as he waved his spatula at the crowd. At the center of it all stood the Land Rover, parked between the 2 granite pillars, its battleship gray paint gleaming in the late afternoon sun. The red citation paper was long gone, replaced by a beautiful hand-polished brass plaque mounted on the front grille, inscribed with the words, "The Vance Homestead, established 1867, let no man lock the harbor." When it came time to dedicate the gate, Eleanor, the new HOA president, stood on a small wooden bench and raised her glass. "My friends, neighbors, and guests," she said, her voice clear and warm. "Today we are not just dedicating a gate. We are dedicating a new beginning. For too long, our community was defined by rules, fines, and divisions. But today, thanks to the immense generosity and grace of Commissioner Marcus Vance, We are defining ourselves by connection, education, and mutual respect. This gate does not stand to keep us apart. It stands as a monument to how we can live together in peace, respecting our history while building a brighter future for our children. The crowd erupted into applause, the sound carrying across the quiet bay. Eleanor stepped down and handed me a large hand-carved oak key, the symbolic key to the new gate. I walked up to the podium looking out at the crowd of faces. I saw the residents of the Heights, who had once looked at my farm with suspicion, now smiling warmly. I saw the kids from my maritime class, their faces covered in chocolate cake and dust, waving their miniature wooden oars at me. I felt a deep, overwhelming sense of peace, a feeling that my grandfather's long struggle to protect this land had finally been validated and completed. "Thank you, everyone," I said simply, my voice carrying a quiet strength. "My family has been in this valley for a very long time. We have seen many things change, but our commitment to this land and to our neighbors has never wavered. This gate is always open to anyone who comes in search of friendship, learning, or a quiet place to watch the fog roll in. Let's keep it that way." With a simple pull of the rope, the red ribbon across the arch fell away, and the massive iron gates swung open with a smooth, silent glide, their heavy brass hinges perfectly balanced. The crowd cheered, and the children rushed through the entrance, eager to explore the farm. As the sun began to set over the western hills, casting a warm golden glow across the valley, I sat on my porch rocking chair holding a fresh cup of coffee. The Land Rover sat quietly in the driveway, its battleship gray body silhouetted against the bright water of the bay. I knew that there would be more challenges in the future, more changes to the valley, and perhaps more people who would try to test the boundaries of my land. But as I watched the fog begin to roll back in from the open ocean blanket, wrapping the pine trees in a familiar gray embrace, I knew that we were ready. The roots of this farm are deep, the history is strong, and some things will never ever be moved. Months have passed since the dedication, and the winter snows have begun to cap the pine ridges around Miss Bay. The youth maritime program continues to grow, and my weekends are now spent teaching the older kids how to loft full-size boat templates from the architectural plans we draw together on big rolls of heavy brown paper. We are currently preparing to build a small wooden canvas kayak, a lightweight design that the kids will be able to paddle down the winding creeks of the valley when spring returns. Eleanor often stops by on her walks, occasionally bringing a fresh-baked apple pie or a thermos of hot cider to share on the porch. We talk about the valley, about the progress of the local schools, and about how the neighborhood has slowly settled into a genuine cooperative spirit. The residents of the Heights have largely abandoned their obsessive reliance on rigid regulations, replacing their fines with conversations and neighborhood cleanup days where everyone helps out. Sometimes when the wind blows hard from the northeast and the cold rain lashes against the windows of my study, I find myself looking at my grandfather's old 1867 land grant map. The ink is faded and the edges of the paper are worn and fragile, but the words printed upon it remain as clear and sharp as the day they were written. It is a symbol of a contract, a binding promise between the builders of this nation and the families who cleared its forests and sailed its waters. It is a reminder that the true strength of a community does not lie in its ability to restrict, exclude, or fine its members, but in its capacity for historical preservation, shared work, and genuine mutual support. Victoria's gold-plated clipboard is now nothing but a distant, ridiculous memory in this valley. Her manufactured empire has been reclaimed by a community of real neighbors who understand that some boundaries are meant to be respected and that some historical roots are simply too deep to be cleared away for an entrance boulevard. The Land Rover Series IIA stands in my workshop, fully restored, rugged, and ready to face whatever the next season brings. Its battleship gray paint, formulated to withstand the harsh, corrosive salt of the open sea, remains completely untouched by the winter cold. A testament to what can be achieved when you build with precision care and an unyielding respect for the history that came before you.